Hey friends, my name is Mitch Tibble and I have with me today Keith Weezer. Keith is the lead pastor of Resonate Church in Pullman, Washington. Keith, how you doing, brother?
Good. It's good to be with you.
Man, great to be with you, man. Thanks for being here. We're at Sin Summit here in Lubbock, Texas. This is a collegiate church planting event as we are inviting churches to come to think through how do they become a multiplying church, or is God calling certain young men to be collegiate church planters or planting in a college context. I invited Keith here today because I want us to discuss, how do we posture ourselves as churches to reach college students and think about not just reaching college students, but become a church that is multiplying and sending to other college contexts to raise up disciples and just to continue perpetually send. So Keith is the guy. Keith, again, thanks for being here. And as we get going here, I know if someone's watching this video, you probably know Keith a little bit about Resonate, but share us a little bit about your story, about how you go from Texas to Washington State and what's going on with you.
Yeah, totally. So one of my most significant, transformational moments was in college. And then as I'm asking, okay, Lord, what do you aim in my life towards? There's this moment to be able to say, hey, there's all this stuff that's happening on the college campus. I want you to point your life towards changing lives in this context. And I have a moment really in a worship setting where God outlines to be able to get out of the South, which I did not want to do, to be able to aim my life towards college and to do it in the context of a church that looks radically different. And at that point I'm like, okay, that's super broad, but just kind of kept using those as compass points for my life. And those led me to a year after that moment to get married, to move up to the Northwest, and to point my life towards college students. And that eventually took me to Washington State University. And at Washington State University, I was there as a campus minister doing parachurch ministry, and really had this significant moment. And I talk about this being in a stadium where I'm looking around at the masses of college students and recognizing that our 50 people in our campus ministry compared to the massive amount of lostness, there was just a sense of we could not make an impact with the current context of methodology and maybe that could happen in other places, but in ours, it's really clear. So we kept going back to scripture and beginning to say, okay, what happened? How did this movement of Christianity happen? And really going back towards this idea of a disciple-making movement that had a church orientation to it. So that led us in 2007 to really start Resonate Church, kind of out of a parachurch ministry. And that's kind of where we've been going since then.
So tell me a little bit more about, you got 50 students, you're in the football stadium, you see 20,000, and you're like, I've got to think bigger. I've got to lift my eyes up here.
Yeah.
I think there's probably a lot of churches out there that are thinking the same thing. It's like, okay, maybe we have something going here, but it's like, I don't really know how do I think bigger? How can I see this as merely us just trying not to lose students, or us just trying to add a few more students? To think about this as how do we multiply? Take us through that process of how you got there. How do you begin to think?
Yeah, I think that oftentimes what I saw in my life and what I've seen in other people is that bigger is 30% more than what I have right now.
Dude, yeah.
And so that's the idea that I can stay in my paradigm and I can tweak some things. Yeah. And it might happen that you grow 30% bigger, but I think one of the things that really transformed for me is when I thought about adding a zero to that. So what would 300% bigger be? Or just being able to say, okay, that's when you begin to say, okay, what a 300% growth would be. I have to actually think through that the way by which I'm doing this, I can tweak this, but that's not going to create 300% growth. I'm not going to change who I am, my giftedness. There has to be a different format. So I think that's the thing that I would challenge people to say, okay, when we think through this, it's got to be you get together in your team and you begin to say, okay, what if? What if we did that? And allowing yourself to have those moments where you can just simply allow yourself to dream. One, it energizes your team together. And two, it begins to say, hey, if we did this, what do we not do anymore? What do we have to change? And let's say you don't do any of those things, but sometimes out of that absurdity comes the things that you would have never been able to see if you hadn't have pressed yourself into that context. So in that moment, we go back to Scripture and say, okay, what is 300? Like, what is impacting 20,000 students look like? And we just begin to say, okay, these things will never do that. We can't continue to put our effort towards that. We have to think differently. So
I feel like you, from what I'm hearing, it's like you created, okay, if we're going to do this much bigger, okay, if this is our picture of what we want to do, okay, let's work backwards to figure out how we do that. And to do that, I think something that was really, what you said is like, rather than you trying to do this alone, like if you could bring a team around you to think through, okay, what would it look like for us to increase this by 300%? And then, like, how do we get there and invite other people, even other people in your church, whether that's a college minister, whether that's other people on staff, to think through, like, okay, how could we do that? Like, how could we leverage the gifts here to reach that? Which seems absurd, because, like, I think even we did this recently with our lead team, with our collegiate, SBTC collegiate, like, roundup stuff. It was like, okay, hey, if there's this many campuses here in Texas, and we want to reach all of them in 5 years, you got all the resources, you got everything, you like, how do you do it? And it's amazing to hear, like, when you put people in those scenarios, like you put that pressure, you kind of create that urgency.
Yeah, absolutely.
The things that will actually come up, like people will think outside of their box.
Yeah, totally.
To think about that. So I really love that. Well,
like, let me give you the specific thing that we said is like, we want to get to 1,000 people, and then we want to start sending people out. Like that was, even though I'm not sure if I would say that was the right thing now looking back, we had 50, and we began to say, okay, what does 1,000 look like? And so at 50 to 1,000, at 50, as the director of the campus ministry, everything was connected to me personally. Yeah. So I did all these things. At 1,000, you begin to say, okay, there needs to be multiple levels of leadership. And so that was the paradigm change. Yeah. Is that there has to be a team of people. And so we need a new paradigm for staffing. We need a new paradigm for really team building, and to be able to figure that out. And so that was the big change, was when we began to understand, okay, so I have to think differently about me. And if I think differently about me, then that begins to break out really how this thing can grow. So
what are things, if, again, with 50, you can control that, you can shepherd that.
Right.
1,000, you can't. What are some of the things that you just had to kind of die to start, as you begin to release control to other people? Like, what were some of the things you had to
So I think one thing that would be helpful, there's a resource that a guy named Ram Sharon did that basically said there's a leadership pipeline. And every time you move towards a greater amount of leadership, like basically just think about a magnitude of, like a 10x shift. So you have to, whatever the thing that got you there's some things that you have to unlearn. Yeah. So one of the things, like, we get into this oftentimes not because we want to have high level organizational leadership, but we love people and we want to see people changed. Yeah. And so we put ourselves into places where we're in direct pastoral relationships. If you think of yourself as a Lego block and you have a certain finite amount of relationships that you can maintain, then that's your limit. So one of those things that you have to, like, as you begin to go and level up to the next part of leadership, you have to say, okay, I can't spend time with that group of people anymore. And that's hard because sometimes they expect you to do that. Yeah. Like one of the most painful things is when people say, I thought you were going to be this kind of pastor, right? And to be a pastor to greater amounts of people, to be able to extend the kingdom of God, I might not be able to have the same kind of relationship with that person that I used to have in the past. And so that's that thing where you have to say, okay, I'm going to give up maybe doing those, or limit the amount of pastoral care that I can expend towards specific people. I'm not saying don't do any of it, but that's one of those things, okay, I'm going to have to give up that. Right now it's giving up preaching. So being able to say, okay, there's other people that can communicate the word of God and can do it better than me. And so I have to figure out, okay, if vision, strategizing, clarifying, being able to get into a place where our future is defined, I can't spend the X amount of hours in a context of preaching. And those are painful things. Like, I love to be able to minister to people. I love to do that one-on-one discipleship. I love to preach. And each one of those things I've had to say, what is it that I give up, and those are always painful in the moment, and then you begin to recognize, okay, there's a growth in this other part of me, and that's pretty exciting.
Yeah, that is really exciting, and I think that's probably one of the hardest things for a lot of folks to give up is like thinking about giving up control and handing it to folks. Like, how do you? How do you begin to identify? Okay, like who do I need to bring around me? Like who do I need to bring around me? Who do I need to raise up and kind of hand this off to? Because I think that's one of the things I often get asked when I'm talking to leaders, or probably really a barrier I see is like you see a leader that says, okay, I can lead this amount of people, but they don't know how to raise up the leaders around them to begin to give away that leadership. So I don't know, how are you identifying those people? How are you figuring out who to bring around you to do that?
I think that you're using some of these, just observing their fruit. And I would just say, it makes sure that you are looking at fruit and not package. So we use a phrase like look for David's, not Saul's, and because
that's really good.
that is super. It's been super helpful to be able to say, when we actually look at fruit, that's the stuff that is going to be revealed eventually, but sometimes it isn't revealed at the very beginning. So just that's the key thing. And we've made mistakes, and then you just begin to have these guys that begin to rise up over time, and you're like, oh man, I wish that I'd seen this earlier. And so I think that's part of it. I keep going back. The more I do this, Paul is just brilliant when he tells Timothy, hey, entrust these things to, and then he gives that clarification, to reliable men. And so that is, over time, I've seen in a multiplying environment, that reliability trumps giftedness. So in an addition-oriented thing, that giftedness trumps reliability.
Yeah.
And so we begin to look for the most gifted person and begin to say, hopefully they'll be reliable.
Yeah.
But in multiplication, what you see is, hey, over time, that fruit is going to be revealed, and so that reliability factor. And then just people that are connected to your values, so that they're culture building individuals, and so that they can begin to say the things that they naturally do. They say they're in alignment. And again, over the years, I've made too many assumptions that because they say yes with their mouth, because they say, hey, I'm here in this context, that they actually are in alignment with their the reflexive values that they have. And so just watch those actions and pay attention to those way more than words. So that's my advice.
What advice would you give? Let's say you have a pastor, you have a church, you have a college ministry, you have a good college minister, and the thought is, hey, we've got a great ministry here, they're incorporated into the body, but now we want to begin to try to start a new ministry, we want to plant a church on a new campus. Like, what advice would you give that person as far as a road to go down to start to explore this, or even take steps of action to begin to do? Is to say, hey, take your college ministry and go plant them out, try to raise up another one. Like, what would you say? What are some initial thoughts you could give?
I think that's all over the place. One is, man, if you're thinking about that, keep chasing after that, and don't be afraid of failing. Just, you're not going to get it right. Just expect that you're going to try something and you're going to spend some money on it, and it may not work out, and don't stop. So I think that's the key thing, is just not thinking you have one shot with this. There's just too many things that are brilliant ideas that just need multiple iterations to be able to realize, and people just don't have the patience for that. So one, just do it. Two, in terms of how to do that well, what we've done is we've typically tried to figure out, are there low risk situations for someone to experiment with something? So is there any kind of low risk environment for someone to be able to try this out and see if they have aptitude for it, to see if there's a sense of people following, if all these key factors for success are there. And what's unique about the college thing is oftentimes it's a lower risk opportunity, and so being able to identify a place where or you can try something on the college campus is really, really helpful. And so so maybe that's not very specific, but just trying to figure out how to say yes to that next opportunity.
Yeah. Something you mentioned yesterday was in this whole, in just sending and thinking about multiplying, planting churches, that college ministry can be the engine for this. Can you kind of flesh that out on why that's so versus maybe a church in the suburbs and, like trying to get people and jobs and families to move, like flesh that out for us.
Yeah, okay, so there's just so many factors to that. One is college students are in a malleable scenario in their life. So they're in a place of transition. Whenever you're in a place of transition, like there's just so much more opportunity for something to enter into your life that can transform trajectory. So good, bad, whatever that is, but just being able, like churches have to put in front of college students opportunities for their future, because this is this moment. Like if you're not, as a church, doing that with your college students, you're missing a massive moment, because they're more likely to say yes. They don't have financial pressures yet. They don't have family pressures yet, in terms of families of their own. And so you can set trajectory, and then those finances and family realities can get formed around a preset trajectory. If not, then there's a vacuum, and something's going to fill those things. Yeah. Something like it's a career, it's an American dream, it's a sense of like, hey, I had this hobby, or I want to travel. Something will fill that, and so this is your opportunity to fill that. The other thing too is, I think underneath this, they are the engine, because college students just objectively, by them being in college, rise up to a certain level of leadership. And in that leadership, you are effectively, by harnessing that, you're ensuring that the leadership of your church and even outside of your church has some forward motion to it. And I think, like, if we could say, hey, the one thing, if we put our eggs into one basket, that if we had a church that created more leadership and more leaders, like that is this thing that would potentially create health around all of our churches in every aspect. And so if you were to say, so the one thing whenever I walk on a college campus, I was just at Texas Tech here, or on the campus, immediately start praying, Lord, I want to pray for leaders and wisdom. So those are the two prayers for the last 15 years as I've walked onto college campuses. Because I think if we have wisdom to know what to do, and we have leaders to do it, then there's just a great openness to that. And so that engine idea is their availability and their potential. And so you harness those two things, and really the underlying reality that the college campus is really a leadership engine. And so if that's achieved, then there's just so much more hope for our churches in the future.
Oh, totally. And I think even, Barnum put out some research a few years ago on the state of pastors. And one of the things that it mentioned in there was, in the last 20 years, the average age of a pastor has jumped 10 years. Really? I think it was like from 45 to 55.
My goodness.
Like in the mid-90s, it was, average age of a lead pastor was 45. Now it's like 55. So you see, it's like age, and there's like kind of a gap in kind of leadership that's being risen up. And I think so much of, not that that's a main issue that we serve here, but it's like, man, where are those leaders at? And I think that college age is such an important time to shape and mold people by the gospel that will eventually be those leaders, that will be those pastors, that will go and really lead the church of the future. Not just, church of the future, but also the church.
So I'll go to places, and I'll just anecdotally say, hey, how many of you, your entry into this career of being a pastor and this calling of being a pastor happened during college? And so we're not talking even about the future. This is how historically people have come into this. It is by far the majority of people. I don't just say, hey, raise your hand. They're like, yeah, this happened somewhere between 18 and 24. Yeah. And so this is not something we need to be convinced of, but just recognize.
Yeah, something thinking about, okay, you you've got young college students, you're developing them into future pastors. And one of the things that you mentioned, which I thought was, I hadn't thought about it this way, but you said we want to raise up our pastors to be multipliers, primarily multipliers, not just orators.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of a shift for
Sure.
a lot of
Sure.
people, because you think about it being a pastor, you preach and you shepherd, but you're like, I need my guys to be multipliers. I need my guys to be disciple makers. How does that flesh out? What does that look like for y'all?
Well, so you just look at what the trend line is for how non-Christians are consuming things that change them, and I think lectures are not a primary source of transformation, and even a primary source of a conduit of information. Mm-hmm. Like it's rare that, so even TED Talks, right, which have become kind of the new monologue thing, they've taken off because they've condensed the amount of information into bite-sized small things. Now you could say that takes a ton of talent to be able to do that, and you'd be right. But the idea of what role that plays in the future compared to complete, the growth of a human, like the growth of someone into this, I think that there's a growing sense of people are changing from all these other things in their life compared to the things that are changing just because of having a passive role in an environment to listen to a subject matter expert. And so, in this case, you have these pastors that would be subject matter experts. You just don't see that as being as effective as it has in the past towards that. So if we begin to say that's the skill that you need, and you don't need to be able to have all the rest of this human development skill around you. Like I was a speech communication major because when I went to college, like this was if you go to a secular school, this was like the preaching degree,
Yeah.
And so, but now I think that if you were to go in that and be able to say, okay, how does actually people grow and how do they learn and how do I design environments around that? Mm-hmm. That's missiology, and that missiology and disciple making stuff. You do that, and here's the other thing too: content. We are in a content-rich world where if they want content, probably the skill they need is more is someone who can take and really be able to specifically get that content and what they need most, and not to be able to just be a content generator, but a content curator. And so if you can do that, I think that is a unique skill that right now, hey, you need to hear this. I don't necessarily need to prepare this talk, but I do need to help understand. I need to help you to understand how to get that information. I think that's the new pastoral skill that has to be developed. So there's some people that are called to be content generators. But it doesn't necessarily have to be everyone on the local level. So, yeah, that might be a kind of a crazy thought, but
yeah. Well, I think just real practically, what does that look like for your guys? Even you at this event, you got two guys, young guys. What is that? How are you shaping that in them? What does that look like for them to lead?
Yeah. So one of the shifts that we've made is to be able to collaboratively put together sermons. Yeah. And so to be able to shift that from, hey, this is a 20-hour-a-week sermon prep, we're aiming for 5 hours a week. And so that goal is for them to be able to have a shared experience together where they're taking and being able to say, hey, there's multiplicity of voices that help us not to have blind spots, not to have one of those things where we're kind of going down the same thing. Like for a young preacher, like sometimes it's like I got one sermon and I'm going to take that and I'm going to redo that over and over as I begin to have life experience.
It finds its way into every message.
Exactly. I've been there.
Yeah.
And so when you have that collaborative thing, other people speak into that and say, hey, here's the biblical principle, here's the kind of a rough outline. You need to make it your own, you need to contextualize it. But that allows you to be able to say, hey, I can give 5 hours to this, and so that's an appropriate amount in the context of what I need to do as a lead pastor, and then in the rest of it, I'm trying to figure out how I can point you to to people who are just, have years of experience, and I think that's a better way. We've also done video preaching, so if our guys are like, hey, this week is crazy, I don't even have 5 hours, there's something that they can be able to say, hey, I can still provide this teaching moment, but it's at a very low cost. So that's a few things that are practical for us.
Man, that's really good. That's really good. Well, Keith, thanks for your time today. I really
absolutely.
appreciate it.
Yeah, it's good.